A democracy that's strong, fair, and true depends on you. Introducing onAir, a nonprofit, nonpartisan digital democracy network. It's a hub that connects citizens with their government and with the candidates, the issues, and each other.
Good evening. I'm Connor Oatman, and I will be your host for this evening's US On Air Aircast. Our sponsor tonight is Democracy on Air, a nonpartisan nonprofit that supports the US On Air network of 50 governance and election hubs at us.onair.cc. Our Aircast today will focus on the decision to end the federal mask mandate, as well as Russia's new aim in military strategy in Ukraine. For some more background on the first issue of the decision to end the mask mandate, here's a short video.
Joining us now, Steve Hall. He's a national security analyst and a former CIA chief of Russia operations. He knows a thing or two about how the Russians operate. It's good to have you on, Steve. I mean, your knowledge always helps us understand. One big picture question I want to ask you is this, is what the Russian goals are now and can they have achieved them? The Russians are now publicly saying this morning that their goal really is this. They want to basically capture the entire coastline of Ukraine, including Odessa, and then connect to Moldova, the Transnistria region we ask about. Is that achievable for Russia?
You know, Jim, I think it's going to be a tough road to hoe, even though if you look at the map, I mean, it looks like the Russians, of course, control quite a bit, as well as the separatists, so-called, that are also cooperating with them. So they've also got a large swath of this. But as of today, you're absolutely right. What we heard is that they're going to look even further to connect up a little further over here. So they've already got all of this. What they're looking to do is to get into this area right here, which is Moldova. This is Moldova, and there's already Russian troops in this part of the country. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to push all the way through. Now, to do that, though, what they've got to do is they've got to get to Odessa. This is a really key tactical and strategic point, because if they get all of this, then you'll see what happens pretty quickly, is that you've got a country, Ukraine, which is entirely cut off from the sea. If they take all of this and are able to link up with those Russian troops that are already in Moldova, that's going to be a significant challenge. But it's not going to be an easy thing for the Russians to do, I don't think.
To help us understand more about the decision to end the federal mask mandate, we have invited Paul Sullivan, our Speak Up director with US On Air. Thank you for being here, Paul.
Always glad to be here.
So what do you think are the biggest implications regarding the future of the pandemic in the United States now that the federal mask mandate has ended, especially as we are starting to see a bit of an uptick in cases across the country once again?
And I think it's important to actually note the uptick in cases. Like, the big fear always with ending mask mandates is a sort of spike, a sort of like an N-shaped spike, so it like curves upwards. When you think cases are like declining and it goes back upward. That's always the fear in these sorts of instances. And I think at least in terms of what this signals in terms of the state of like public opinion, I think a lot of people are just kind of wanting normalcy. We've had a pandemic. We've basically been living in fully masked, fully vaccinated, like COVID world for the last, roughly 3 years. People are starting to feel that, we want to be able to travel again without being too restricted. And that's not to say that we should definitely end this. No, the COVID is still out there. It's still very real. But I think one of the things that we ought to consider is that people are starting to want to travel again. This summer, more than any, is one that people want to travel in. And I think that's something to consider.
Thank you. We will now move into our panel and discussion. Our panel today has on it our featured guest, Paul, as well as Prakash, our director of Ukraine On Air, and Ben Murphy, the executive director of US On Air. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Since there is a 20-second delay from our live stream, we ask that our YouTube live audience to submit their questions in the chat field as soon as they can. So just to begin and to kind of continue off of discussions with Paul, given the uptick in cases, do you feel like it was a smart move to end the mandate? I mean, we're all aware that obviously people are tired of masks. They're ready to be done with the mandates. But do you feel that it was still too soon?
I'll start off here. I think that like Paul's analysis is generally something I agree with. I mean, I think that you're seeing even people who at the beginning of the pandemic were ones who were advocating for like staying inside, masking everywhere. You're seeing even some of those kind of people become tired, and understandably so, of a lot of the precautions that continue. And I think something that needs to be taken into consideration too is the fact that a lot of people at this point have had four vaccine, or I think it's four, and I believe there's a fifth now, booster that's been approved for over individuals over 50. And I think that a lot of people are getting to the point where they're saying, okay, well, I've done everything right. I've done everything I've been told. I stayed inside for a year. I've masked everywhere. I've gotten four, if not five shots, and I'm still being told that, I can't really return to, kind of my normal life. And I also think that we're at a point now where it's become an individual's decision essentially whether they're going to wear a mask or not. So I don't know if I think the timing is right, but I think that regardless of the decision, people have already made up their mind, and this mandate is not going to, I don't think this mandate will actually or like the removal of the mandate, that is, actually change whether people wear masks or not. I think at this point you've either decided you're going to wear it in public, or you've decided you're not going to. And also decided if you're going to go, to crowded events or travel, whatever. I don't think this is too substantial of a decision.
Yeah, I would agree from what Ben said that, so many individuals as of now or at this point are getting pretty tired of just wearing a mask or just complying with the mask mandate. But at the same time, it's also important to note that masks could be used as an option of the last resort if at any point our country, let's say, is inflicted by another outbreak, or let's say a subvariant comes about, Omicron 2.0, or say the subvariant of Omicron comes to or starts percolating across the United States and parts of the world, and starts to create a massive uptick of number of cases reported. Now, this is when the mask mandate would be imposed for that purpose. So again, yes, we are in the process of entering into that state of normalcy, but at the same time, if it would be more substantial for the US government to use the mask mandate as an option, like of the last resort, or as an option, or as like an emergency option if their country is experiencing, let's say, another outbreak of a subvariant.
And I would like to add on to what Ani was saying about last resort. I think an interesting use and an interesting decision, given this sudden decision to end the mask mandate, is of a strategic use of masking requirements. I think it's kind of an understandable, not understandable, but it's less so that term, but I think it's a fact of life that there are just some people that just aren't fans of masks and just won't mask up, even if there are laws requiring them. And it's always going to be a small percentage, but I think even it's only going to grow more severe as time goes on, ever since like people are getting tired of them. And I think it's important to have a very strategic use of them, to say, so it's my understanding of the science that although COVID infection rates, especially given like the end of the mask mandates across the country, they have gone up, hospitalizations have gone down. And I could, if there's no information about this, I'm willing to be proven wrong on this. But I think the important statistic that we have to consider is hospitalizations. And we've done a lot of good work over the past 2.5, 3 years. But as a last resort, I think it is a very smart and very strategic decision for our policymakers to have it when there's truly a danger. And that's not to say that COVID isn't a danger, especially for the immunocompromised. They ought to still have mask mandates. But in conditions like these, we should consider the implications of having both an on and an off switch, so to speak.
Thank you all for your comments. We'll now move into our second topic of the day, that being Russia's change in aim with its military policy in Ukraine. For some more background on this issue, we have another short video for you.
We've got this news that's coming in just moments ago. The Department of Justice is weighing in tonight on the national travel mask mandate being overturned. It says that if the CDC concludes that requirement is still necessary on public transportation, it will appeal the Florida judge's ruling. Now, the news comes as the TSA is no longer enforcing the mandate, leaving it up to businesses and individuals. CBS's Errol Barnett is at Reagan National Airport with the latest.
There was jubilation in the skies as passengers found out masks were no longer required.
No one's any happier than we are.
One flight attendant celebrating in song. All major U.S. airlines made mask wearing optional once the TSA said it would no longer enforce the federal rule. Airport officials in Houston today carting away these mask requirement signs, the nation's busiest airports all making masks optional. The White House, hoping to keep the mandate in place through May 3rd, was caught off guard by Monday's announcement. CBS's Nancy Cordes today asking President Biden for his view.
People continue to wear masks on planes.
That's up to them.
But inconsistency remains in places where local mask mandates still exist, like Philadelphia and New York City. So for now, flyers into those cities will have to mask up once they land.
To help us understand more about Russia's new aim and military strategy in Ukraine, we have invited Ani Prakash, the director of Ukraine on Air. Thank you for being here, Ani.
Thank you for having me.
So to begin, within Russia's new military aims and the new territories that it is trying to seize control of, that being Transnistria, connection to Odessa, a way to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea and other areas that allow it more freedom to operate militarily. What do you see, should they be successful with this, the greater direction of the war going in?
So I would say that if the Russians happen to be more successful in reclaiming their control of the Black Sea, if the Russians successfully extend their presence from Mariupol and create, a second land bridge from Crimea to Odessa to be able to send their forces from Transnistria and isolate the Ukrainians before capturing the Black Sea, I would say that, economically speaking, Russia would have a significant advantage in just crippling Ukraine's economy and even preventing the Ukrainians from receiving as many exports they need necessary to help bolster their economy. Because think about it, Odessa is one of the most, it's a critical port strategically and even economically for the Ukrainians. Majority of Ukrainians receive their exports, foreign exports specifically, from Odessa. And if the Russians gain control over Odessa and cut off that given portion of the Black Sea coast, and this would significantly deteriorate the Ukrainian economy and give Russia the strategic advantage to be able to continue their advances of capturing southern Ukraine before switching to Kiev. So,
thank you. We'll now move into our panel today with the same discussants. Again, since there is a 20-second delay from our live stream, we ask that our YouTube live audience to submit their questions in the chat field as soon as they can. So in the grand scheme of the continuing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I wanted to discuss with each of you. Obviously, Ukraine and Russia are not the only countries with coastlines on the Black Sea. Do you feel that Ukraine would gain any advantage or aid from any other Black Sea coastal countries in terms of shipping, should Russia be successful in cutting off Ukraine's direct access to the Black Sea? Or do you feel like any other nation with a coastline on the Black Sea would be too worried about fully ameliorating themselves into the Ukrainian-Russian conflict?
I think the obvious country to look at in terms of this whole extension of coastal boundaries is Turkey. They control the strait in and out of the Black Sea, and it's for this very reason that Russia and Turkey, and what was then the Ottoman Empire centuries before, have such a historical animosity, and it goes back such a long way. And I think it is entirely likely that if something were to happen, that Ukraine would reach out to Turkey, and by extension would reach out to the rest of the Western world, as they have been doing for the last several weeks. So I think the obvious country is Turkey.
So I would agree that Turkey would be one of Ukraine's closest allies to reach out to in the event that Russia cuts off the Black Sea or cuts off Ukraine within the Black Sea. But you also have to keep in mind that there are two additional littoral states that are NATO member countries that have coastlines in the Black Sea. One is Bulgaria and the other is Romania. And the thing about Bulgaria and Romania, unlike Turkey, Bulgaria and Romania are two democracies, though they're politically speaking, are close allies of the United States and close allies with Ukraine. Turkey, on the other hand, is a bit more Islamist under the new Erdogan government. And if Erdogan were to think about Erdogan has energy interests with the Russians. And given that if Erdogan decides to ally with the Ukrainians, they're cuttingly, then this would give Russia the opportunity to cut off energy interests and trade interests from the Turkish. So again, Turkey does have that strategic advantage to cut off the use the Dardanelles and Bosphorus to prevent Russian warships from Syria to enter into the Black Sea. But if Turkey doesn't have to be, let's say if Turkey is not the ally willing to aid Ukraine in the defense, then Bulgaria and Romania can hop in, and Bulgaria and Romania can send their naval ships to back the Ukrainians to come into Ukraine's defense should Russia cut them off in the Black Sea.
I think that's great analysis. I don't have much to add.
Do you see it being realistic that they would engage in active defense and conflict with Russia through, like Bulgaria and Romania, for example, through their navies, or that way they would focus more in terms of a potential export supplies and shipping line into Ukraine should their direct coast be cut off?
So I'll start. So I guess for Bulgaria and Romania, honestly, for Ukraine's economy, it's pretty important given that it's now under siege since the invasion. But given the whole conflict that is unfolding, for Bulgaria and Romania, I guess, to protect their regional security, it would be under their best interest to focus more on pursuing those war fighting efforts just so that they can protect Ukraine within their coastlines from Russian advances. So if the Bulgarians and Romanians were to be drawn into this regional conflict with Russia, then their number one strategy is to pursue warfighting efforts to help stymie off Russia's influence or Russia's presence in the Black Sea. And number two would be focusing on exports and supplies, which for the Ukrainians. So I guess in terms of conflict, military would be an important priority for the Bulgarians and Romanians before they decide to transition themselves towards focusing on export supplies to help aid the Ukrainian economy.
I think a key thing to consider when looking into all these countries is like sort of domino effect. If something were to happen in the Black Sea and just one wrong miscalculation in terms of any actor in this, right? Bulgaria, Turkey, Romania, all those countries, and even on land borders, Article 5 of NATO, that's the big consideration. Like all of NATO gets brought into the conflict, and after that, escalation just goes up and up, right? As soon as you have more moving parts, you start having more instances of, the big nuclear button at the very worst, or at the very least, like a larger European war.
Yeah, I think Paul brings up a good point. I mean, we're looking at it from, Ukraine and Turkey and NATO countries' perspective, but I think obviously that's something that Russia needs to keep in mind too. I mean, they're going to be making the same kind of calculations we're talking about here, and you have to wonder if there's if that kind of a concern about involving NATO is something that is, something that's actively at the back of their mind. I mean, obviously I'm certain that it is, but I would expect that kind of a conflict is something that Russia is acutely aware of, and is, trying to make determinations of, gaining as much ground in Ukraine as it can without getting in unnecessary regional or international conflicts beyond what it already has, obviously.
I would also agree that if Bulgaria and Romania were to be impacted by Russian advances, and if Article 5 were to be invoked, that this would not only draw NATO into this conflict with Russia, but think about the dangers of nuclear war, right? U.S., France, and the United Kingdom are the only three NATO member countries. U.S. has the ability under the nuclear deterrence policy to dock any nuclear weapon within countries part of NATO, so they can dock short-range ballistic missiles and submarine-launched cruise missiles within the coastlines of Bulgaria and Romania. And the Russians, on the other hand, can dock their ballistic missiles maybe in Sevastopol or even near, their coast, or even near the Sea of or coastlines near the sea, the Azov Strait, so that which could further exacerbate the dangers behind nuclear conflict should if Russia intensify the conflicts.
Thank you all for your comments. We'll now take any live stream questions if we have them. We do have one. For those of you that are familiar with it, if any of you are, what did you think about Sachs' commentary in CNN that a negotiated peace is the only way to end Russia's war in Ukraine and that Ukraine should remove NATO as a future option?
I think I'll start on this one. I think in terms of just, if we're looking at this from a geopolitical perspective, I'm very cynical to the idea that the animosity between between Ukraine and by extension NATO and the West and Russia is going to end. And if we consider, and I think this is one of the major themes behind a lot of Russian military strategy, it's this idea of the world island and of that of Russia's vulnerability, especially from their western flank. It is something that has been affecting them ever since the Russian Empire. It has affected them in the Soviet period, and it still affects them now. And at this point, it is possibly the weakest point that the Russian state, as we know of it now, has been in terms of strategic defense. And a lot of people are recognizing that Ukraine is just basically one step to try to regain that ground they once had in the Soviet period, perhaps.
Any other commentary on the question?
I mean, I think Paul's right. I mean, negotiated peace is obviously would be a nice kind of end to this conflict, but I think you have to wonder what that looks like for from Russia's perspective. What would be terms that they'd not only be willing to accept, but would be willing to pretty much, I mean, realistically, this conflict has been an embarrassment to them. It's displayed a lot of weaknesses within their military. I mean, strategy-wise, I mean, institutions within the Kremlin. I mean, there's plenty of embarrassments that have come from this. So you almost have to wonder if they're feeling a little bit of the sunk cost fallacy, where they might feel that they need to ride this out because they've come so far already. So I think that, negotiated peace would be a nice outcome, but I wonder what Russia would actually be willing to accept, what kind of terms they'd be willing to accept, with obviously their concern of the West being a little delusional, but I mean, from their perspective, I suppose it seems rational.
Also, another thing to consider is that the Putin government, as we know it now, even if Putin were to somehow not exist in office right now, a lot of Russia's elite still has that mindset, that Cold War mindset of it is us versus the West. And it's still filled with, like Putin, ranks of current FSB and ex-KGB intelligence heads, which all still have that mindset. And this mindset within the higher levels of the Russian political authority, that's not going to change for years. And it's actually quite a bold thing to say that it might change in even decades. So it's something which is going to require a tremendous reshaping of the Russian paradigm, at least in terms of politics. And it's hard to see. It might happen, perhaps in our lifetimes, but it's going to take decades at the very, very least.
Yeah, I would also agree that it's pretty much a tall order to negotiate a peace settlement with Russia, given their, let's say, their intentions of not of being unwilling to end this conflict. Yes, we would want some sort of a peace settlement to help mitigate these disasters that we are witnessing. But think about Russia, as Paul mentioned. Their government is now controlled by, or let's say their inner circle of Putin's administration is controlled by ex-KGB officers and the current FSB leaders who have the Cold War mindset, considering the West as the craven, hypercritical, and morally decaying force. And With Russia and the Kremlin administration having such officials like these, honestly, they have transformed themselves as a pariah to the international community, for say. Having such officials with paranoid personality disorders and such mindsets and rhetorics that demonize the West, this would clearly send signals that it's just impossible or just unsuccessful for the Western countries to even attempt on negotiating a peace settlement with a country that pretty much wants to transform themselves as what USSR was once in the Cold War and just reshape the world order into making it like 1947 when the Cold War first started.
Thank you all for your comments. That is all, folks, for this evening's Aircast. Thank you to our participants for all of your great comments once again, and thank you live stream audience for watching and for your questions. You can go to the first post on the us.onair.cc homepage to learn more about today's news, view videos and live streams, and to comment